Hello, everyone. We're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence. A little more than 2 weeks ago, the U.S. celebrated its 247th birthday. It's one of the oldest continuous nations under one document uh, in the world. Uh, and we're going to talk about how that happened, how the U.S. became an independent nation. It wasn't all of a sudden we woke up one day and said, well, we don't really like the British. We want to do things on our own. It was more of a stepwise process. And it derived from two things. Next slide, please. The first was the fact that from almost the beginning, we were a diverse nation, even before we were a nation. We not only, of course, had Native Americans, as well as Africans imported from the continent of Africa, primarily to serve as slaves. But we also had Dutch settlers, English settlers, German settlers, Swedish settlers, Scots settlers, Welsh, Irish, um, French, Portuguese, Spanish. So right from the beginning, as you can see from this map, uh, we were already a very different entity from most countries in Europe. Next slide, please. However, Great Britain and France didn't much like each other in the mid 18th century. And although most of the war was fought over in Europe, some of it spilled into the American colonies. Now you see these red colonies. These are the 13 original British colonies. And the British wanted to consolidate their holdings after they defeated the French in the so-called French and Indian War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, although it had been going on in Europe, as I mentioned, for a considerable time before 1756. So the British drew a proclamation line here to avoid conflict with Native Americans and to avoid conflict with France and the province of Quebec, which was settled by the French. And the second issue to keep in mind is that, as we all know, wars are very expensive. And although only a small part of this English-French war was fought in the colonies, the British wanted some compensation. He said, hey, look, after all, we protected you against the French, and now the bill is becoming due, and we want you to help us out and pay. And that seemed very reasonable to the English, but not very reasonable to the American colonies. Now, why was this so? Well, the American colonies had existed for almost a century, just doing pretty much what they wanted. They were prospering. They were trading not only with the British Empire, but also with other countries in Europe. In other words, they were sort of left alone. Now, all of a sudden, the British come over and say, "Hey guys, we want you to support our military enterprise, and we want you to support the financial losses that we experienced fighting a war, because wars are expensive." So, what Parliament, the British Parliament, which ruled Great Britain for the most part, what they did in 1765 was pass the first tax levied directly on the American colonists. Now, none of us like taxes, right? But the Americans liked them even less because they had never been taxed. Now, all of a sudden, they were being taxed. And there was some resentment for this because it was a tax on all paper documents, newspapers, for example, legal documents. Uh, and the colonists in America said, "Hey, we're not going to do this. We're not going to pay these taxes. I mean, you fought a war against France. That's your business. Uh, it doesn't really concern us. Uh, and besides, we have our own representative assemblies. They have the power to tax, but we don't want to be taxed by some far off parliament where we're not even represented. It's taxation without representation." So the resistance against paying the tax was successful. And in fact, so successful that just a year later, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. But Parliament was not finished with the US. The following year, in 1767, they wanted to assert its authority by passing legislation to tax goods that Americans imported from Great Britain. And the purpose behind this is that, as I said, the colonies traded with everybody before 1763. And some of that trade was illegal. They were not giving any taxes to the British. Uh, so what happened was, when these taxes were levied in 1767, the Americans said, "Hey, we're going to boycott all Britain, that is British. We'll trade with the French," which of course was the arch enemy of the British. We'll trade with the French. We'll trade with the German states. We'll trade with the Dutch, but we're not going to trade with the British. And the leading colony was Massachusetts, because Massachusetts, particularly the port of Boston, was usually the entry and exit point for a lot of the goods coming from Great Britain and going to Great Britain. Uh, so, in order to quell the resistance, the British sent troops to occupy Boston. This was an escalation. It's one thing to pass laws, but it's another thing to send troops. And not only that, but where are these troops going to stay? There are no there were no places to stay. Well, guess what? You're going to get a knock on your door, and soldiers are going to stay over your house for the next months or years. And this, of course, did not sit well, especially with the folks in Massachusetts. And they resisted. Next slide, please. And you can see the colonists lobbying against the taxes by this cartoon. Next slide, please. So the colonists protested, and in Boston in December of 1770, they demonstrated. They were not armed, but they were large numbers of them. And the British troops, as you can see from this painting, the British troops fired upon them, killing 5 protesters. And this event became known as the Boston Massacre. Of course, killing 5 people is not the definition of a massacre, but to generate opposition, growing opposition uh, to the British, it was good to write about this as a massacre. Uh, and one of the men, the first man to fall, was Crispus Attucks, who was an African American sailor. Uh, and the what happened was that the massacre, so-called massacre, became a great propaganda tool for the colonists, not only in Massachusetts, but all over the 13 colonies. Uh, Next slide, please. Now, eventually, the British withdrew their troops from Boston, and they repealed most of the taxes that they had levied, but they left in place one tax, and that was the tax on tea. And the colonists, being British, love to have their tea. And now suddenly we had a tax on tea. That looked to Americans like the British were trying to stick it uh, to them. Uh, and so what happened was in December of 1773 in Boston Harbor, again, the main port for the colonies, a group of colonists threw the tea overboard, as you can see here. And that really angered the British government. They had paid a lot of money for this tea and looked forward to getting compensation from the colonists who would buy the tea. And when that didn't happen, oh boy, that is now time for the British to ratchet up, to really put the pressure on the colonies. Next slide, please. And one of the things they did was to recognize the sovereignty of Quebec, the province of Quebec. Now, here you see on this map, there are the 13 colonies in the province of Quebec were bordering each other. And this was a danger for many colonists, particularly in New England, who had fled because of religious persecution. And the province of Quebec was almost 100% Roman Catholic, and they really feared the Roman Catholic religion, particularly the Pope, and they worried that they would be very aggressive, not only in promoting their religion, but also in moving into the 13 colonies. So that was an alarming move. But even more alarming, and if you could have the next slide, please, Even more alarming, of 1774. And what the coercive acts did was close the port of Boston. In other words, it basically shut off Boston from the rest of the world. Uh, and uh, it protected British colonial officials who were charged with crimes. In other words, if you were a British colonial official and you were charged with a crime in the colonies, tough. You couldn't be. Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which demanded that the colonists keep British soldiers throughout the colonies in private homes. So these measures eventually led to the colonists in all the colonies getting together and deciding that something had to be done because their livelihoods and their liberties were actively being threatened. Next slide, please. So in 1774 in uh, Philadelphia, the 12 of the 13 colonies met for the first time. This was the first time that these colonies had gotten together. So it was an important meeting in September of 1774. The only colony that did not attend was Georgia because it was literally too far away from Pennsylvania to attend. And the meeting was led by John Adams. Uh, and what they wanted uh, was an end to the economic, what they perceived as the economic and political oppression of the colonies. They did not want independence. This was not really an issue at this Congress, and instead they appealed directly. They bypassed Parliament because they figured, well, Parliament is one making all these darn laws, so why knock your head against that wall? Instead, they appealed directly to King George III, the king, and the king ignored them, didn't respond, uh, and at that point, the colonists figured that it was time to consider independence. The issues were primarily not only economic, but also political. The colonies were being taxed without being represented in Parliament, and their main source of income was being cut off by the British. And the presence of large numbers of troops in the colonies was also uh, threatening. So the colonists got together and after not hearing from the king, decided that they would need to protect themselves. Next slide, please. So in April of 1775, British General Thomas Gage led a force of British soldiers from Boston to Lexington, where he planned to capture colonial leaders and then seize their weapons. But American spies learned of their plan, and the British force was confronted by 77 American militiamen on the common of the town of Lexington, and they began shooting each other. And that started the American Revolution. The British lost 73 dead, another 174 wounded, and 26 missing in action. Still, the colonists did not want independence. What they wanted was to go about their business, still connected to the British Empire, because the British Empire was a wonderful economic opportunity because it was connected to ports around, literally around the world. But what good was it if American ports were closed? Um, so, next slide, please. So finally, uh, in June of 1776, more than a year after the fighting began, the colonists decided that it was time for independence. And they tasked three men, Thomas Jefferson, whom you see standing, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin sitting down, to draft a formal statement of independence. Thomas Jefferson, the gentleman standing, wrote basically wrote it. The other two made some minor edits, and we celebrate. The Declaration of Independence became a significant landmark in the history of democracy. In addition to its importance to America as a fledgling nation, it exerted tremendous influence outside the US, most memorably in France during the French Revolution. Uh, and so it, it provided not only a voice of freedom for the colonists, but also a voice of freedom for the people. Next slide, please. And here you have the original document, July 4th, 1776. We the people, in order to form a more perfect. Next slide, please. However, this was not a perfect nation, not by any stretch of the imagination. Although the Declaration of Independence said that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. This was in reality not the case. It was not the case, certainly, for Black Americans, most of whom were slaves. Next slide, please. It was not the case for many Americans who were Roman Catholic. And here you see the destruction of a Catholic convent by a Protestant mob in Boston, the seat of the American Revolution, in 1835. Next slide, please. Frederick Douglass, the former slave and the great orator, was invited in 1852 to give a speech. on the 4th of July. And he said, hey, why should I celebrate the 4th of July? Why should I celebrate the 4th of July? I mean, most of my brothers and sisters are in chains. They're slaves. I'm going to give you my 4th of July speech, but I will do it on the 5th of July. And he said, I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. Next slide, please. Yet for other Americans, other than Black Americans, the Declaration of Independence was a crucial document in promoting equality. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and in 1848, she cited the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. What a wonderful statement. It had never been made before, but during the French Enlightenment, there were comments about this. John Locke, a British philosopher, wrote about it. How about women? If all men are created equal, that should and must include women. And so in 1848, she gathered the first group of women in Seneca Falls, New York, and issued a Declaration of Independence for women, which of course followed the original Declaration of Independence. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, Roman Catholics were generally not included in the American enterprise. However, Irish immigrants who were, of course, overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, came over to the U.S. during the potato famine of the 1840s and 1850s. And like many immigrants since then, they embraced the idea of equality. They embraced the idea that all men are created equal. And they looked to the Declaration of Independence to underscore their own citizenship, that we're just as equal. I mean, all men are created equal. That's what the document says. Next slide, please. And of course, slaves were still not included in that document. However, they looked to it as a beacon, as an objective that say, hey, we're Americans too, as the most American of documents. And during the Civil War in the 1860s, slaves took their own freedom. Not only did they take their own freedom, next slide, please, but the former slaves fought for their freedom during the Civil War. Next slide, please. In 1876, America celebrated its 100th anniversary, the stride of a century. Slavery was dead. The Union was consolidated. Women were getting their rights. Roman Catholics were getting their rights. And it was reason to celebrate. Not only reason to celebrate, but it created a great deal of optimism in the country. Next slide, please. As the Industrial Revolution went on in the late 19th century, it attracted literally millions of immigrants, and America became known as a nation of immigrants. And they too looked to the Declaration of Independence as their document guaranteeing equality. Next slide, please. And finally, in 1960, America elected an Irish Roman Catholic, or a descendant from an Irish Roman Catholic family, as president, something that would have been inconceivable even 30 years earlier. What the Declaration of Independence demands is expanding our democracy, expanding equality for all. And next slide, please. When Martin Luther King Jr. led his March on Washington in August of 1963, 500,000 black and white Americans demanding equality. This is what he said. 50 years ago, a great American, meaning Abraham Lincoln, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The momentous decree came as a great beacon of light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Declaration of Independence, and again, here you have this reference to the Declaration of Independence. They were signing a promissory note to which every American is to become an heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now is the time to make real these promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Again, referring to the Declaration of Independence. Next slide, please. And lo and behold, in 2008, we elected president, something that would have been inconceivable 40, 50, 60 years earlier. And what President Barack Obama did was again refer in his address to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, not only to support each other and America, but also to enjoy the freedom to criticize our government as embedded in those glorious words of the Declaration. And his memorable speech. And if America is to be a great nation, the Declaration of Independence must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain, Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain in Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Thank you all very much. I'll be happy to answer your questions. However, before we do that, I mentioned the Declaration of Independence as a beacon, not only to secure our rights, but also to criticize the government. And you see this picture here. This is me. In October of 1967, marching on the Pentagon, which is where our defense establishment, our military establishment is located, because we were protesting against the Vietnam War. And as you see, this immense crowd, tens, hundreds of thousands of people, there is no army there. There are no police. This is the essence of protest that is guaranteed by our Declaration of Independence. So we marched not in fear. We marched in opposition to our government, but in support of the basic principles of the Declaration of Independence. Thank you all very much. Question: where is the original Declaration now? What main contradictions of the Declaration of Independence could you name? Well, the original Declaration of Independence is in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, because that was where it was written and signed. Main contradictions of the Declaration of Independence. Well, all men are created equal. Well, guess what? In New Jersey in 1776, 2% of the population was eligible to vote. And these were white men with a certain amount of property. And they had to be Protestant Christians, not Roman Catholics or Jewish citizens. So, again, the Declaration, the important thing about the Declaration is that it's a reference. It's an aspiration. We're not there yet in the full embodiment of the Declaration, but it has served a great purpose in elevating our gaze toward full equality. Question 2, have you heard something about Kosciuszko, who was born in Belarus? I hadn't realized that Kosciuszko was born in Belarus. I always considered him Polish, or at least my Polish friends considered him Polish. Yeah, Yeah, in fact, when I lived in Brooklyn, I remember driving across the Kosciuszko Bridge to visit my girlfriend. So Mr. Kosciuszko has a very warm place in my heart. But I honestly did not know that he was from Belarus. But that's good to know. Um, could I make a lecture about Kosciuszko in the U.S.? I don't know that much about Kosciuszko. I would have to do some research about it, and then perhaps we slavery and the slave trade, including in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. No, because the purpose of the Declaration of Independence was and I didn't read the whole thing to you, obviously, against the British. Uh, and it was not a social document in terms of right of in terms of rights of slaves. In fact, um, some slaves defected and were encouraged to defect to the British side during the American uh, Revolution. But I will say that the Declaration of Independence was responsible for several states, including Massachusetts, uh, to abolish the institution of slavery. What is the relationship between Americans and British now? Does the colonial past affect modern relations? Um, I would say it's pretty good because the language I'm speaking to you is English, and uh, the and Thomas Jefferson, who wrote most of the Declaration of Independence, uh, was a student uh, of the Democrats in Great Britain, particularly John Locke, who talked about liberty and uh, equality. Uh, so the relationship is pretty good. We have differing objectives. I mean, many of our Irish American folks don't like the British because of the history between Ireland and Great Britain, and my aunt included in that. So it, 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 like all relations, sometimes we've had tensions, but we have a common language, a common history, and a common belief in government by the consent of the governed. Um, Tell us how you celebrate Independence Day. What does it mean to you? It means it's it's a renewal and a reminder of that we still have a ways to go to achieve the objectives of Thomas Jefferson's document. But we celebrate it with parades, with orations, and with hot dogs and hamburgers. And generally, it's a day of celebration. And at the end of that day, when the evening falls, we shoot off fireworks. Uh, and this concludes our celebration of July 4th. It's important because it's one of the few holidays we all can celebrate together, regardless of race or religion. And it, it's important in that respect. Uh, recommend other Obama speeches worth reading. Yeah, I would do that. In 2004, before he became president, Obama gave a wonderful speech on racial equality in America. at the Democratic National Convention in July of 2004, and I would strongly recommend that you read that. Okay, what personal sacrifices did the signers of the Declaration of Independence make in terms of their personal wealth, security, or family life in order to support the cause of independence? A great question, because these guys, these men, were wealthy. They had prospered under the British Empire. And to revolt against the British Empire meant they would be hanged if caught, uh, at worst. And if they lost the war, the Revolutionary War, they would also, and their families would also lose their fortunes, their wealth. I'm glad you brought up this question, because uh, sometimes when we talk about the American Revolution, we are not cognizant of the risk that these folks took, uh, both to themselves, their property, and their families. How did the ideas and principles expressed in the Declaration of Independence influence the development of American political thought and subsequent founding documents, such as the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Again, a great question. Um, as I've said, the Declaration of Independence was an aspiration. The Constitution was more of a governing document. But I can tell you that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, those who promoted the Bill of Rights looked back to the Declaration of Independence and said, look, if we are going to honor that declaration, we need statements about individual rights. Any other questions? If not, I want to thank all of you for your questions and for your attention on this important topic, for especially for this month of July. And I look forward to being with you again. Thank you all very much for your participation.